The warm Miami sun cast long shadows across the basketball court as Michael, Big Shaq, Thompson wiped the sweat from his brow. At 42, he still maintained his impressive 6'5" frame, though his days of professional basketball were behind him. The empty court had become his sanctuary over the past few years, a place where he could escape the whispers and well-meaning questions about when he and his wife Lisa would start a family. The truth was far more complicated than anyone realized. For 7 years, Big Shaq and Lisa had been trying to have a child. They'd weathered the storm of countless doctor's appointments, failed fertility treatments, and 3 heartbreaking miscarriages. Each loss had carved deeper lines into their faces, but somehow their love had grown stronger through the pain. "You still out here, baby?" Lisa's gentle voice carried across the court. She stood at the entrance, her dark hair catching the evening light. Even after 15 years of marriage, the sight of her made his heart skip a beat. She walked over, her medical scrub still on from her shift at the children's hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse. "Just thinking," Shaq replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The basketball felt heavy in his other hand, like the weight of their dreams. "Remember when we first talked about having kids? We thought it would be so simple." Lisa leaned into him, her voice soft but steady. "Nothing worth having comes easy, that's what my grandmother always said." She paused, gathering courage for the words she'd been holding on to all day. "I saw something at work today. Something that made me think." Shaq turned to face her, recognizing the tone in her voice. It was the same one she'd used when she'd first suggested fertility treatments, when she'd proposed they try alternative medicines, the voice of hope refusing to die. "There's this little boy," she continued, her eyes growing misty. "He came in for a routine checkup. He's been in the system for almost 2 years now. His social worker mentioned they're looking for permanent placement." She looked up at her husband, reading the emotions playing across his face. "I know we've talked about adoption before, but maybe this is the universe trying to tell us something." The word adoption hung in the air between them. They'd discussed it in passing during their darkest moments, but always as a distant possibility, a last resort. Now, standing on their favorite court where they'd shared so many dreams, it felt different. More real. "Tell me about him," Shaq said softly, surprising himself with how right the words felt. Lisa's face lit up. "His name is David. He's 4 years old, smart as a whip, and has the biggest brown eyes you've ever seen. He loves basketball, can you believe it?" She laughed, wiping away a tear. "When I saw him playing with a little toy hoop in the waiting room, I felt something, Shaq. Like this could be our chance." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the court in shades of purple and orange, Shaq pulled Lisa closer. The basketball court had always been where he felt most at peace, where he could think most clearly. And now, as he stood there with his wife, he felt a new kind of peace settling over him, the kind that comes with realizing that sometimes the best plays in life aren't the ones you drew up on the board. "Maybe you're right," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe this is our chance to be the parents we've always wanted to be. Different path, same destination, right?" Lisa nodded against his chest, and for the first time in years, their shared silence wasn't filled with unspoken pain, but with possibility. As they walked hand in hand off the court, leaving the basketball behind, they both knew they were stepping onto a new court, one where the game of life was about to change in the most beautiful way possible. That night, as they lay in bed, they talked for hours about what adoption might mean for them. They discussed their fears, their hopes, and their dreams. They talked about the challenges they might face and the joy they might find. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, they made a decision that would change not just their lives, but the life of a little boy who needed exactly what they had so much of to give: love. The children's wing of Hope Memorial Hospital was quieter than usual when Big Shaq walked through its corridors the following week. His heart thundered in his chest, making him feel like a rookie before his first big game. Lisa had arranged for them to, coincidentally, be around during David's follow-up appointment, a small step that their social worker, Mrs. Chen, had approved. "You're going to do great," Lisa whispered, squeezing his hand. She was already in her scrubs, having started her shift early. "Just be yourself." Shaq nodded, tugging nervously at his polo shirt. He'd changed outfits 3 times that morning, wanting to look approachable but not too formal. "What if he doesn't like basketball?" he blurted out, voicing one of the 1,000 fears running through his mind. Lisa's laugh echoed softly in the hallway. "That's what you're worried about?" "Not the 100 other things that could." She stopped as Mrs. Chen rounded the corner, her kind face brightening at the sight of them. "Perfect timing," Mrs. Chen said, adjusting her glasses. "David just finished his checkup. He's in the playroom." She paused, her expression turning serious. "Remember, this is just a casual introduction. No pressure, no expectations. We're just letting things unfold naturally." They followed Mrs. Chen to the hospital's playroom, a cheerful space filled with toys and books. Through the observation window, Shaq caught his first glimpse of David. The boy sat cross-legged on a colorful mat, completely absorbed in building a tower of blocks. His tongue poked out slightly in concentration, reminding Shaq of himself when he used to practice free throws. "He's been working on that tower for 20 minutes, Mrs. Chen said softly. "He never gives up until he gets it right." Something in Shaq's chest tightened at those words. He thought about all the times he and Lisa had picked themselves up after each setback, how they'd never given up on their dream of becoming parents. Maybe this little boy had more in common with them than just a love of basketball. Lisa gave his hand one final squeeze before heading off to her station, leaving Shaq with Mrs. Chen. "Ready?" she asked. The playroom door felt heavier than any gym door he'd ever pushed open. David looked up briefly as they entered, then returned to his blocks. The tower wobbled precariously. "Hey there," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "David, this is my friend Mr. Thompson. He used to play basketball." At the word basketball, David's head snapped up, his brown eyes widening. The sudden movement sent his tower crashing down, blocks scattering across the floor. His lower lip trembled slightly. Without thinking, Shaq knelt down, his large frame making him eye level with the boy. "You know what? I've had plenty of games that felt just like that, when everything came crashing down right at the last second." He picked up one of the blocks, turning it in his hands. "Want to know what I learned?" David nodded hesitantly, his eyes fixed on the block in Shaq's hands. "I learned that sometimes when things fall apart, we get to build something even better." Shaq placed the block on the mat between them. "What do you think? Want to try again?" For a moment, David just stared at the block. Then, slowly, he reached for another one, placing it carefully on top of Shaq's. Together, they began rebuilding, one block at a time. As they worked, David gradually opened up, asking questions about basketball and sharing his own dreams of becoming super tall one day. "You're already pretty tall for your age," Shaq commented, helping steady a particularly wobbly section of their new tower. "That's what Miss Lisa says too." David beamed. "She lets me use the big kid drinking fountain even though I'm only 4.5. He held up 4 fingers, then struggled to fold one down halfway, making Shaq chuckle. The morning passed quickly, filled with block towers, toy cars, and stories about basketball. When it was time to leave, David surprised everyone by giving Shaq a quick hug around the legs. "Will you come back?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. Shaq looked at Mrs. Chen, who gave a subtle nod. "How about next week? I hear they've got a mini basketball hoop around here somewhere." David's face lit up like Christmas morning. As Shaq left the playroom, he found Lisa waiting in the hallway, trying to pretend she hadn't been watching the whole time. Her eyes were misty, but her smile was brighter than he'd seen in years. That evening, as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset, Lisa and Shaq talked about the visit. "He's so resilient," Lisa said, curled up in her favorite chair. "Mrs. Chen told me his background, what he's been through. Most kids would be broken by it, but he just keeps building those towers, no matter how many times they fall." Shaq nodded, thinking about the determined look on David's face as he'd placed each block. "You know what got me? When he asked if I was coming back. Like he was ready to hope, but scared too at the same time." "I know that feeling," Lisa replied softly, reaching for his hand. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in thoughts of the little boy who'd begun to claim a piece of their hearts. Finally, Shaq spoke. "I want to do this right. No rushing, no pressure. He deserves that much." Lisa squeezed his hand. "We'll take it one block at a time, just like you did today." As night fell over their neighborhood, they began making plans, not the rigid, expectation-filled plans of their fertility treatment days, but gentle, hopeful plans. They talked about clearing out the spare room, about children's books and basketball hoops sized for 4-year-olds. They dreamed about future birthdays and holidays, all while reminding themselves to take things slow. That night, before bed, Shaq found himself standing in the empty spare room. In the darkness, he could almost see it transformed, walls painted a warm color, a bed with superhero sheets, shelves filled with books and toys. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel like a symbol of what they'd lost, but of what they might gain. The weeks that followed turned into a beautiful routine. Every Thursday morning, Shaq would arrive at the hospital playroom with a new basketball story to share. David would be waiting, usually with his blocks or sometimes with paper and crayons, ready to soak up every word. Their bond grew stronger with each visit, built on shared smiles and small victories. One particularly memorable morning, Shaq brought along some photos from his playing days. David sat on his lap, eyes wide with wonder as he pointed at each picture. "You could jump that high?" he gasped, studying a photo of a younger Shaq mid-dunk. "Sure could," Shaq chuckled, remembering those glory days. "But you know what's even better than jumping high?" David shook his head, curiosity written all over his face. "Having someone to cheer for you when you land." The boy grew quiet, his small fingers tracing the edges of the photo. "I don't have anyone to cheer for me," he whispered, the words hitting Shaq like a physical blow. "Hey now," Shaq said gently, turning David to face him. "What about Miss Lisa? She tells me she cheers super loud when you reach the drinking fountain all by yourself." A small smile crept across David's face. "Yeah, and Mrs. Chen clapped when I tied my shoes yesterday. See? You've got people in your corner, little man. More than you know." That evening, Shaq and Lisa sat in their kitchen, surrounded by adoption paperwork. The formal process had begun, and reality was setting in with all its bureaucratic weight. Their coffee had gone cold hours ago as they worked through form after form, each question more probing than the last. "Look at this one," Lisa sighed, pushing her reading glasses up her nose. "Describe your approach to discipline and structure. How do we answer that when we're still figuring it out ourselves?" Shaq reached across the table, taking her hand. "We answer it honestly. We tell them about our values, about teaching through love and understanding. About second chances and learning from mistakes." He paused, thinking about David's fallen block towers. "We tell them about persistence." The next few days brought a whirlwind of activity. Home inspections were scheduled, reference letters were gathered, and background checks were initiated. Their families rallied around them with overwhelming support. Shaq's mother immediately began knitting a blanket, while Lisa's parents started clearing space in their garage for a lifetime's worth of future Christmas presents. But the process wasn't without its challenges. One afternoon, during what should have been a routine visit, David had a difficult day. The usually cheerful boy was withdrawn, refusing to play or even look at Shaq. Mrs. Chen explained in hushed tones that David's previous potential adoption had fallen through exactly 1 year ago. Some days are harder than others, she said sympathetically, watching David curl up in the reading corner with his favorite stuffed elephant. The important thing is to show him that you're not going anywhere. So that's exactly what Shaq did. He sat quietly nearby, not pushing or pressuring, just being present. After what felt like hours, David's small voice broke the silence. "Can you read me a story?" "Always," Shaq replied, his heart swelling as David cautiously scooted closer. The following week brought another milestone, their first supervised visit outside the hospital. They chose a local park, wanting to give David a chance to run and play in the open air. Lisa packed a picnic basket full of carefully chosen snacks, while Shaq brought along a child-sized basketball. The morning dawned bright and clear, perfect park weather. David arrived with Mrs. Chen, clutching his elephant and looking nervous but excited. His face lit up when he saw the basketball. "Want to try some real moves?" Shaq asked, leading him to the park's small court. For the next hour, they worked on dribbling and passing, David's laughter echoing across the playground. Lisa sat on a nearby bench with Mrs. Chen, trying not to cry as she watched her husband lift David up for his very first slam dunk. During lunch, David sat between them on the picnic blanket, happily munching on pizza-shaped sandwiches that Lisa had made. He chatted about his favorite colors, his best friend at the group home, and his dream of having a pet dragon someday. "Maybe we could start with a goldfish," Lisa suggested, sharing an amused look with Shaq over David's head. As the visit drew to a close, David grew quiet again, but this time it was different. He hugged both Shaq and Lisa tightly, holding on a little longer than usual. "I wish every day could be like today," he mumbled into Lisa's shirt. On the drive home, Lisa and Shaq were mostly silent, both processing the emotions of the day. Finally, Lisa spoke up. "I keep thinking about what he said at the end. About wishing every day could be like today." Shaq nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "I know. I've been thinking about that too." He glanced at his wife. "We're doing the right thing, aren't we? Moving forward with this?" Lisa reached over, placing her hand on his arm. "Look how far we've all come already. Remember that first day in the playroom? Now look at us, planning picnics, making memories, building trust. It might not be the path we originally imagined, but it's perfect," Shaq finished, thinking about David's face as he made his first basket. "It's exactly where we're supposed to be." That night, they added another item to their growing collection of adoption paperwork, a letter to the review committee, expressing their commitment to providing David with a loving, stable home. They wrote about their journey, their struggles, and their dreams. But mostly, they wrote about a little boy who never gave up on his block towers, and how he'd taught them that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from rebuilding what falls apart. The transition from summer to fall brought new developments in their journey. The Thompsons' home was slowly transforming, childproof locks appeared on cabinets, corners were cushioned, and the spare room was painted a warm sunny yellow, David's favorite color. Each change made their dream feel more real, but also heightened their awareness of everything that could still go wrong. One crisp October morning, Shaq stood in what they'd started calling David's room, holding a small basketball jersey he'd had custom made. The number 4 was emblazoned on the back, for David's age. He ran his fingers over the stitching, remembering how David had mentioned never having his own jersey during their last visit. "Honey?" Lisa's voice carried up the stairs, pulling him from his thoughts. "Mrs. Chen is on the phone. She says it's important." Shaq's heart jumped into his throat as he hurried downstairs. Lisa had the phone on speaker, her face unreadable. Mrs. Chen's voice filled their kitchen, carrying news that made both of them sink into their chairs. David's biological aunt had suddenly come forward, expressing interest in custody. "I know this is difficult to hear," Mrs. Chen said gently, but we're legally obligated to explore family placement options first. I wanted you to know before your visit tomorrow, in case David mentions anything." After the call ended, Lisa and Shaq sat in stunned silence. The small jersey lay forgotten on the kitchen counter, its bright colors seeming to mock their pain. Finally, Lisa spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Shaq reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "We do what we've always done. We keep showing up. We keep loving him. And we trust that what's meant to be will be." The next day's visit was harder than any game Shaq had ever played. David was subdued, clearly picking up on the tension around him. He clung to his elephant stuffed animal, speaking only in whispers. When he finally opened up, his words broke their hearts. "Are you going to leave too?" he asked, looking up at Shaq with those big brown eyes. "Aunt Jenny says she wants me to live with her, but—" His voice trailed off as tears welled up. Shaq knelt down to David's level, fighting to keep his own emotions in check. "Hey, look at me, little man. Remember what I told you about my basketball days? About never giving up, even when things got tough?" David nodded, clutching his elephant tighter. "Well, that's exactly what we're going to do now. No matter what happens, Lisa and I will always be in your corner. Sometimes life throws us some hard passes, but that doesn't mean we stop playing the game. Understand?" The weeks that followed were a blur of legal consultations and anxious waiting. They learned that David's Aunt Jenny lived 2 states away and had only recently learned about David's situation. The evaluation process would take time, during which their adoption process would be put on hold. But instead of pulling back, Shaq and Lisa doubled down on their commitment. They continued their regular visits, each one more precious than the last. Lisa started keeping a journal of every moment, every smile, every small victory. Shaq taught David new basketball moves, watching with pride as the boys' confidence grew despite the uncertainty surrounding them. One particularly memorable afternoon, they were playing in the hospital's small outdoor area when David mastered his first proper dribble. His face lit up with such pure joy that Shaq had to turn away for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. "Did you see that?" David exclaimed, bouncing the ball again. "I did it just like you showed me." "You sure did, champ." Shaq cheered, scooping him up for a victory lap around the playground. Lisa captured the moment on her phone, adding it to their growing collection of memories. The situation with Aunt Jenny developed slowly. Through Mrs. Chen, they learned that while she cared about David, she was struggling with the practical aspects of taking in a child. She was single, worked long hours, and lived in a small apartment. The more she learned about what would be required, the more overwhelmed she became. Then came the day that changed everything. Mrs. Chen arranged a meeting between all parties, Shaq, Lisa, Aunt Jenny, and the social services team. David spent the time with his favorite nurse, blissfully unaware of the heavy discussions taking place. Jenny was younger than they'd expected, barely in her 30s, with David's same warm brown eyes. She listened intently as Shaq and Lisa shared their journey, their dreams for David, and their commitment to ensuring he maintained connections with his biological family. "I want what's best for him," Jenny said finally, wiping away tears. "When I first heard about David, I felt guilty for not being there sooner. I thought I had to step up, had to be everything he needs." She looked at Shaq and Lisa, seeing the love in their eyes when they spoke about her nephew. "But maybe what he needs is already right here." The relief that flooded the room was palpable. Jenny didn't want to compete for custody, she wanted to be part of David's extended family, to be the aunt who visited on holidays and sent birthday presents. It was more than Shaq and Lisa had dared to hope for. That evening, as they drove home, Lisa reached over and squeezed Shaq's hand. "You know what this means? We can finally give him the jersey." Shaq smiled, thinking of the small basketball jersey still waiting in David's room. "Maybe we should get one for Aunt Jenny too." Make her feel part of the team. That's why I love you, Lisa laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. You always think about including everyone in the game. As they pulled into their driveway, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. The obstacles weren't all behind them, there were still papers to file, hearings to attend, and adjustments to make. But for the first time since hearing about Jenny, they felt like they could breathe again. Inside, they stood in David's room, surrounded by the life they were building for him. The walls were covered with basketball posters, the bookshelf filled with stories waiting to be read, and the small jersey hung proudly by the window, catching the last rays of sunlight. You know, Shaq said, pulling Lisa close, maybe this was all part of the game plan. Getting to know Jenny, making her part of our family too. It's like building a stronger team. Lisa nodded against his chest. David deserves to have as many people loving him as possible. After everything he's been through, he deserves a whole cheering section. Winter arrived with a flurry of activity. With Aunt Jenny's blessing documented and filed, the adoption process gained new momentum. The Thompsons' home buzzed with energy as they prepared for the next big step, overnight visits. Each weekend brought them closer to making their family complete. The first overnight visit was scheduled for a Friday in December. Shaq paced the living room, checking and rechecking everything while Lisa arranged and rearranged the snacks in the kitchen. They'd baby-proofed the house twice, but still worried they'd missed something. What if he gets homesick? Lisa fretted, adjusting the pile of blankets on the couch for the 5th time. What if he can't sleep? What if? The doorbell cut off her worries. There stood Mrs. Chen with David, who clutched his elephant and a small backpack. His eyes were wide as he took in the Christmas decorations twinkling throughout the house. You have a Christmas tree, he exclaimed, momentarily forgetting his nervousness. The tree stood proud in the corner, already surrounded by presents, some from them, some from Aunt Jenny, and others from their extended family who couldn't wait to welcome their newest member. Want to help me put the star on top? Shaq asked, already reaching for David. The boy's delighted squeal as Shaq lifted him to reach the tree's summit echoed through the house, melting away everyone's anxiety. Mrs. Chen stayed for dinner, helping ease the transition. They all sat around the dining table, enjoying Lisa's homemade lasagna, David's favorite meal, as they'd learned during their park picnics. The boy kept looking around in wonder, taking in every detail of what could become his permanent home. And this is your room, Lisa said later, leading David upstairs after Mrs. Chen left. They'd kept the yellow walls but added basketball-themed decals and a reading nook with twinkling lights. The custom jersey hung prominently beside the bed. David walked in slowly, touching everything with gentle fingers as if afraid it might disappear. When he saw the jersey, his eyes grew impossibly wider. Is this really mine? Sure is, little man, Shaq answered, watching from the doorway with Lisa. Want to try it on? The sight of David in his very own jersey, beaming with pride as he posed for photos, made all the waiting and uncertainty worth it. That night, as they tucked him into bed, he asked for 3 bedtime stories, one from Lisa, one from Shaq, and one from his stuffed elephant. Good night, buddy, Shaq said softly, turning on the basketball-shaped nightlight. We're right down the hall if you need anything. They'd barely reached their own room when the first sniffle came. Then another. Soon, quiet sobs echoed through the hallway. Lisa and Shaq exchanged knowing looks before heading back to David's room. They found him sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he hiccuped. I'm trying to be brave, but... Hey now, Lisa soothed, sitting on one side of the bed while Shaq took the other. Being brave doesn't mean you can't feel scared sometimes. Even the biggest basketball stars get nervous before important games, right Shaq? You bet, Shaq agreed, remembering his own pre-game jitters. Want to know what helps? David nodded, clutching his elephant. Having your team with you. How about we all camp out in the living room tonight? 20 minutes later, they transformed the living room into a cozy fort. Blankets draped over chairs created a magical cave, lit by the soft glow of Christmas lights. They laid out sleeping bags, brought down pillows, and settled in together. "Tell me about when you were scared," David whispered, snuggled between them. Shaq shared stories about his first big game, how his knees shook so bad he could barely walk onto the court. Lisa talked about her first day as a nurse, when everything seemed overwhelming until she focused on helping one patient at a time. They talked about fear and courage, about family and love, about how sometimes the scariest things led to the most beautiful changes. Somewhere between stories and quiet giggles, David drifted off to sleep, one hand holding Lisa's, the other clutching Shaq's shirt. They lay awake a bit longer, watching his peaceful face in the gentle Christmas lights. "We're really doing this," Lisa whispered, careful not to wake him. "We're becoming a family." The weekend passed in a blur of precious moments. They made pancakes together, played basketball in the driveway, and video chatted with Aunt Jenny, who was planning her Christmas visit. David's confidence grew with each passing hour, his laughter filling every corner of the house. Sunday evening came too quickly. As they helped David pack his backpack, he turned to them with serious eyes. "When can I come back?" "Next weekend," Lisa promised, her voice thick with emotion. "And the weekend after that. And soon." She looked at Shaq, who nodded encouragingly. "Soon you won't have to leave at all." After Mrs. Chen picked him up, the house felt eerily quiet. Lisa and Shaq walked through each room, straightening up but leaving small traces of David's presence, a toy car under the coffee table, crayon drawings on the fridge, the fort still standing in the living room. "I don't want to take it down yet," Lisa said, touching one of the blankets gently. "Then we won't," Shaq replied, pulling her close. "We'll leave it up for next weekend." That night, they sat at their kitchen table, adding to Lisa's journal. They wrote about every detail they wanted to remember, David's face when he saw his room, his giggles during pancake making, the way he'd finally fallen asleep in their blanket fort. They wrote about their fears and hopes, about the joy of watching him bloom in their care. "You know what struck me?" Shaq said, reading over Lisa's shoulder. "When he was helping me make hot chocolate this morning, he didn't hesitate to ask for more marshmallows. Remember how shy he used to be about asking for anything?" Lisa nodded, wiping happy tears from her eyes. "He's starting to feel safe with us. Starting to trust that it's okay to want things, to need things." The following days were filled with preparations for the next weekend. They bought ingredients for Christmas cookies, planned movie nights, and started a list of potential family traditions they could create together. The adoption paperwork continued to move forward, each signed document bringing them closer to permanency. But the most beautiful change was in their hearts. The ache of their earlier struggles had transformed into something new, not forgotten, but woven into the tapestry of their journey toward becoming a family. Every tear, every setback, every moment of doubt had led them here, to a little boy who needed exactly what they had to give. "You know what?" Shaq said that night, as they finally took down the blanket fort. "I think we're all rookie parents here, you, me, even Aunt Jenny in her way. We're all learning as we go, and that's okay." Lisa smiled, folding the last blanket. "As long as we keep playing as a team, right, coach?" "Right," he laughed, pulling her into a dance around the living room. "And this team?" "This team's going all the way to the championships." As winter melted into spring, the weekend visits evolved into extended stays. David's presence in their home grew stronger, his toothbrush permanently stationed in the bathroom, his favorite cereals stocked in the pantry, his artwork covering more and more of the refrigerator door. The transition was happening gradually, naturally, like a flower slowly opening its petals to the sun. One Wednesday afternoon, Shaq sat in the school administration office of Pine Grove Elementary, his large frame barely fitting in the visitor's chair. Lisa sat beside him, clutching a folder full of documents. They were meeting with the principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, to discuss David's enrollment for the upcoming school year. "We want to make sure everything's in place," Lisa explained, spreading out the paperwork. "The adoption isn't finalized yet, but our social worker said we should start the process now." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled warmly, looking through the documents. "Of course. Many of our students come from diverse family situations. We'd love to have David join our school community." She pulled out a school map. "We even have a basketball court that I hear might interest him." Later that day, they brought David to see the school. His small hand gripped Shaq's tightly as they walked through the colorful hallways. The anxiety radiating from him was palpable until they reached the kindergarten classroom. The teacher, Miss Washington, greeted them with a bright smile. "I heard you like basketball," she said, pointing to a small hoop in the reading corner. "We use it for our word game shots. Every time you read a word correctly, you get to take a shot." David's eyes lit up, his grip on Shaq's hand loosening slightly. "Really? Can I try?" For the next half hour, they watched as David slowly came out of his shell, shooting foam balls through the hoop as Miss Washington showed him around the classroom. When they reached the cubby area, she pointed to an empty space. "This one could be yours. We can put your name right here." "With a basketball sticker?" David asked hopefully. "Absolutely," Miss Washington laughed. "And maybe a star too, since I hear you're pretty good at building towers." On the drive home, David couldn't stop talking about the school. "Did you see all the books they have? And the playground has 2 slides. And Miss Washington said they have show and tell every Friday." Shaq caught Lisa's eye in the rearview mirror, both of them smiling at his excitement. This was the kind of enthusiasm they'd hoped for, the kind that showed David was ready for this next big step. That evening, Aunt Jenny called for their weekly video chat. David proudly gave her a virtual tour of his latest block creation while telling her all about the school visit. "And guess what, Aunt Jenny? They have a real basketball court, just like the one Shaq and I practice on." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Jenny beamed through the screen. "You'll have to show me when I come visit next month." She'd become a constant presence in their lives, sending care packages and staying involved in all the big moments. After David went to bed, the adults faced their own challenges. The final home study was approaching, and the anxiety was creeping in despite their preparation. They sat at the kitchen table, reviewing their documentation one more time. "Medical records are up to date," Lisa murmured, checking off items on their list. "Financial statements are ready. Reference letters are all in." Shaq reached over, gently taking the papers from her hands. "Honey, we've got this. We've been ready for this our whole lives, we just didn't know it." The next few days brought a flurry of activity. They deep cleaned the house, organized David's room, and made sure every safety measure was perfectly in place. But the most important preparations weren't about the physical space, they were about strengthening their family bonds. They established new routines, like their nightly 3 good things ritual where each person shared their favorite moments from the day. They started a family playlist, adding songs that made them happy or reminded them of special moments together. David even began teaching them the special handshake he'd created with his best friend from the group home. The day of the final home study arrived bright and clear. Mrs. Chen walked through every room, asking questions and taking notes. David was at his day program, but his presence was evident everywhere, from the height chart marked on the kitchen doorframe to the collection of rocks he'd gathered from their backyard adventures. "Tell me about your support system," Mrs. Chen asked, settling into the living room. "How are you preparing for the challenges of full-time parenthood?" Shaq and Lisa exchanged glances before Lisa spoke. "We've learned that it takes a village. We have our families, Aunt Jenny, our neighbors who've become like extended family. The school's been incredibly supportive, and we've joined a local adoption support group. And most importantly, Shaq added, we have each other. We've learned to tag team, to recognize when one of us needs a break, to celebrate the small victories and handle the tough moments together. Mrs. Chen smiled, making a final note. You know, when we first discussed David's placement, we hoped to find a family who could provide not just a home, but a foundation for growth. Watching your journey these past months. She was interrupted by the doorbell. It was their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Parker, holding a container of her famous cookies. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company. I just wanted to drop these off for David. He helped me water my garden yesterday, and I promised him chocolate chip cookies as payment. This unexpected interruption proved more valuable than any prepared answer. It showed the natural way David had begun to integrate into not just their family, but the whole community. That evening, when they picked David up, he was full of his own news. I drew our family today, he announced, pulling a slightly crumpled paper from his backpack. The drawing showed 4 figures, him, Shaq, Lisa, and even Aunt Jenny off to the side, all holding hands under a rainbow. Look, he pointed proudly, I made Shaq super tall, just like in real life. And see the basketball? That's for when we play together. And that's our house, with the yellow room that's mine. Lisa hung the picture on the fridge, right in the center. It's perfect, sweetheart. Just like our family. Later that night, after David was asleep, Shaq and Lisa sat on their back porch, their regular spot for processing big days. The spring air was mild, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from Mrs. Parker's garden. You know what I keep thinking about? Shaq said, looking up at the stars. That first day on the basketball court, when everything felt impossible. Remember how scared we were to hope? Lisa leaned against him, nodding. And now look at us. Planning school supplies, arranging playdates, building a life together. It's not impossible anymore, it's real. More real than any championship I ever won, Shaq agreed. He pulled out his phone, showing Lisa a photo he'd taken earlier, David fast asleep, clutching both his elephant and the jersey, a peaceful smile on his face. That's going in the journal, Lisa decided, already thinking about how she'd describe this day. Another chapter in our story. The best chapter yet, Shaq corrected, pulling her close. Above them, the stars twinkled like promises, each one a reminder of how far they'd come and the beautiful journey still ahead. The calendar on the kitchen wall had one date circled in red, July 15th, the day of their final adoption hearing. As spring turned to summer, the anticipation in the Thompson household grew. David was now staying with them full-time, their fostering period nearly complete, and every day brought them closer to making it official. One humid evening, as they sat on their back porch enjoying popsicles, David asked the question they'd been expecting. What happens at the hearing? Do I have to talk to the judge? Shaq pulled the boy onto his lap, cherry-flavored popsicle and all. Well, champ, it's kind of like a big celebration in a fancy room. The judge will ask us some questions, but mostly they just want to make sure we're all ready to be a forever family. But we're already a family, David said matter-of-factly, focusing on his melting popsicle. Lisa's eyes met Shaq's over David's head, both of them fighting back tears. These moments of simple truth from David often hit the hardest, reminding them how far they'd come. The weeks leading up to the hearing were filled with both excitement and nervousness. They'd hired a photographer to document the day, and Lisa spent hours choosing outfits for all of them. Aunt Jenny had booked her flight, determined to be there for the big moment. But life had a way of testing their strength one last time. 2 weeks before the hearing, David came down with a severe case of strep throat. The usually energetic boy was confined to his bed, feverish and miserable. What if I'm still sick for the hearing? He whispered one night, his voice raspy. Will they say we can't be a family? Hey now, Shaq said, adjusting the cool compress on David's forehead. Nothing's going to stop us from being a family. If we need to reschedule, we'll reschedule. The important thing is getting you healthy. Lisa, drawing on her nursing experience, kept meticulous track of his medication schedule and symptoms. She took time off work to stay home with him, reading stories and making chicken soup from her grandmother's recipe. Shaq spent his evenings entertaining David with elaborate puppet shows featuring his stuffed elephant as the star. Even in illness, David showed them new depths of his personality. He worried about getting his germs on his favorite jersey, insisted on trying to make his bed despite feeling awful, and always asked how they were feeling, showing a compassion that touched them deeply. One particularly rough night, when David's fever was high and sleep wouldn't come, he asked for a story about when Shaq was sick as a kid. As Shaq described how his mother would sing to him, David's eyes lit up despite his discomfort. "Can you sing to me?" he asked shyly. Shaq's singing voice was far from professional, but he launched into a gentle rendition of "Sweet Caroline," one of David's favorites. Soon, Lisa joined in, and even David's raspy voice added to the chorus. It became their nightly ritual during his recovery, a reminder that even the tough moments could create beautiful memories. As David's health improved, their attention turned back to the upcoming hearing. Their lawyer, Mr. Patel, visited one evening to prepare them for what to expect. He spread documents across their dining room table while David played nearby with his blocks. "The judge will ask about your commitment to David's well-being, your understanding of the responsibilities of adoption, and your plans for maintaining connections with his biological family," Mr. Patel explained. "Like Aunt Jenny?" David piped up from his block corner. "Exactly," Mr. Patel smiled. "The judge will be happy to hear about your relationship with her." The week before the hearing brought a whirlwind of activity. Their extended families began arriving from out of town, filling local hotels. Lisa's parents insisted on hosting a pre-hearing dinner for everyone, turning their backyard into a celebration space. The evening before the big day, they held a special family night. Just the three of them, plus a video call with Aunt Jenny. They made pizza together, letting David decorate his with pepperoni in the shape of a basketball. They played board games, took silly photos, and finally settled in for a movie marathon in their blanket fort, which had become a permanent weekend fixture. "Can we take a picture of all of us?" David asked during a quiet moment. "For my memory book?" Lisa had helped him start the memory book months ago, filling it with photos, ticket stubs, and small mementos of their time together. She set up the camera timer, and they squeezed together in the fort, genuine smiles lighting up their faces. "One more thing," David said after the photo. He disappeared upstairs and returned with a slightly wrinkled envelope. "I made this for tomorrow. Miss Washington helped me with the words." Inside was a handmade card. On the front was a drawing of a basketball court with 3 stick figures, one very tall, one medium, and one small. Inside, in careful kindergarten handwriting, it read, "Thank you for picking me to be your forever kid. Love, David." The card brought both Shaq and Lisa to tears. They enveloped David in a group hug, his giggles mixing with their sniffles. "You know what, buddy?" Shaq said when he could finally speak. "We didn't pick you. You picked us too. That's what makes it so special." That night, after David was asleep, Shaq and Lisa sat in their usual spot on the porch. The summer air was thick with fireflies, nature's own celebration lights. "Remember our first porch conversation about adoption?" Lisa asked, leaning into Shaq's side. "How scared we were. How unsure." Shaq nodded, thinking back to those early days. "And now look at us. Planning a celebration, surrounded by family, about to make official what our hearts have known for months." "He's already changed us so much," Lisa mused. "I never knew I could love this deeply, worry this much, or feel this complete." "That's what family does," Shaq replied, pulling her closer. "It stretches your heart in ways you never thought possible." They sat there late into the night, talking about their journey, the tears and laughter, the setbacks and victories, the countless small moments that had led them to tomorrow. Their conversation was interrupted occasionally by the need to check on David, each peek into his peaceful sleeping face a reminder of what tomorrow would make permanent. Finally, they headed to bed, knowing sleep might be elusive but not caring. Tomorrow would change their lives forever, putting official words and seals to what they'd known in their hearts since that first day in the playroom, that sometimes the best families aren't born, they're built, one block, one basketball game, one bedtime story at a time. As they passed David's room one last time, they heard his sleepy voice, "Mom? Dad?" It wasn't the first time he'd called them that, but tonight it held special weight. They peeked in to find him sitting up slightly, clutching his elephant. "Just wanted to say I love you," he mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. "We love you too, buddy," they whispered back, their voices thick with emotion. Sweet dreams. Tomorrow would bring its own magic, but this moment, this simple exchange of love in the quiet of night, was everything they'd ever dreamed of and more. The morning of July 15th dawned bright and clear, as if nature itself was celebrating with them. David woke up earlier than usual, padding into Shaq and Lisa's room just as the sun was rising. "Is it time yet?" he whispered, climbing onto their bed still in his basketball print pajamas. "Almost, buddy," Shaq chuckled, checking the time. "Just a few more hours." They'd planned everything carefully. Their court appointment was at 10 a.m., followed by a celebration at their home. The house was already decorated thanks to their families working late into the previous night, with balloons and streamers in David's favorite colors. Breakfast was a special affair. Lisa made her famous chocolate chip pancakes, arranging them in the shape of a basketball. David, usually a ball of energy, sat quietly at the table, carefully eating each bite while stealing glances at his new suit hanging on the back door. "You okay, champ?" Shaq asked, noticing his thoughtfulness. David nodded, then hesitated. "I was thinking about my block towers," he said softly. "Remember when you told me sometimes things fall down so we can build something better?" "I remember," Shaq replied, his heart swelling with pride at David's wisdom. "Well, I think that's what happened with us. Everything fell down before, but now we built something better. Together." Lisa had to excuse herself from the table, overcome with emotion. In the kitchen, she added David's words to her journal, which had grown thick with memories over the past year. Getting ready was an event in itself. David insisted on trying to tie his own tie, determined to master it just like Shaq had taught him. After several attempts, he proudly wore his slightly crooked result. "It has character," Lisa declared, snapping a photo. Aunt Jenny arrived just as they were about to leave, rushing in with hugs and happy tears. She'd brought David a special gift, a handmade scrapbook filled with old family photos and stories, ensuring he would always know every part of his history. The courthouse was already bustling when they arrived. Their entire support system was there, both sets of grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, Mrs. Chin, Miss Washington, and even Mrs. Parker with a container of her famous cookies. The hallway outside the courtroom looked more like a family reunion than a legal proceeding. David held both Shaq and Lisa's hands as they waited, occasionally practicing the basketball breathing exercises Shaq had taught him for nervous moments. When the bailiff called their names, the whole crowd stood, ready to witness the moment they'd all been waiting for. The courtroom was warm and welcoming, nothing like the intimidating space David had imagined. Judge Rivera, a grandmother herself, smiled warmly as they approached the bench. She had reviewed their case thoroughly and began by complimenting David on his excellent school progress. "I understand you're quite the basketball player," she said, making David grin shyly. "Like father, like son," he replied, squeezing Shaq's hand. Those 4 words, like father, like son, set the tone for the entire proceeding. Judge Rivera asked the standard questions. Did they understand the responsibilities of adoption? Were they committed to David's well-being? Would they continue to honor his connections with his biological family? Their answers came from the heart, each word weighted with the love and experiences of the past year. When asked about maintaining family connections, they spoke about their weekly video calls with Aunt Jenny, their shared holiday plans, and their commitment to keeping David's story whole and honored. Then came the moment they'd all been waiting for. Judge Rivera's voice filled the courtroom. Having reviewed all documentation and hearing your testimony today, I find this adoption to be in the best interest of the child. By the power vested in me by the state, I hereby declare David Thompson to be the legal son of Michael and Lisa Thompson, with all the rights and privileges thereof. The sound of the gavel was almost lost in the eruption of cheers and applause. David launched himself into Shaq and Lisa's arms, creating a family embrace that their photographer captured perfectly, tears, laughter, and pure joy all rolled into one moment. "We did it!" David exclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "We're officially official." The celebration continued at their home, where their backyard had been transformed into a festival of love. A basketball-themed cake took center stage, surrounded by photos documenting their journey. Mrs. Parker's cookies disappeared quickly, and the sound of laughter and joy filled the air. David proudly showed off his basketball moves to his cousins, wearing his favorite jersey over his suit. Aunt Jenny joined in the fun, proving she had some hidden talents of her own on the makeshift court. During a quiet moment, Shaq found Lisa sitting on their porch swing, watching the celebration. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Thompson." She smiled, making room for him. "I was just thinking about that day in the hospital when I first saw David. Remember how scared we were to hope? And now look at all this." She gestured to the yard full of love and laughter. "Sometimes the best games are the ones you never saw coming," Shaq replied, pulling her close. As the sun began to set, David gathered everyone for a special presentation. He'd been working with Miss Washington on a poem, which he now read from a carefully decorated piece of paper. "Once I was a builder of towers, watching them fall day after day. Then I met two people with powers, who showed me love finds a way. Now I build new things with my heart, like family and trust and home. Every day is a brand new start. And I'm never alone. Thank you for choosing me to keep, for making my dreams come true. This love we have is strong and deep. And I'm so glad I found you." There wasn't a dry eye in the backyard as David finished his poem. He took a small bow, then ran into the arms of his forever parents, complete at last. That night, after the guests had gone and the cleanup was done, the Thompson family had one more tradition to uphold. They built their blanket fort in the living room, just as they had on their first night together. "Can we do our 3 good things?" David asked, snuggled between them. "Of course," Lisa smiled. "Who wants to go first?" "Me," David said. "My 3 good things are, becoming a real Thompson, having the best parents ever, and..." He paused dramatically, "getting chocolate cake for dinner." They all laughed, sharing their own highlights from the day. As David drifted off to sleep, still in his suit but with his trusty elephant tucked under his arm, Shaq and Lisa exchanged a look that said everything words couldn't. Their journey hadn't been straight or simple. There had been falls and rebounds, timeouts and overtime periods. But in the end, they'd won something far more precious than any championship: they'd won a family. And as the summer night wrapped around their home, 3 hearts beat in perfect sync, each one home at last, each one exactly where they were meant to be. The game of life had thrown them some unexpected plays, but together, they'd created the most beautiful victory of all, a love that would last forever.